Judge Walter Grayson believed he was dealing with an ordinary teenager, a reckless, clueless boy who had made one bad decision too many. But as the defendant began to speak, dismantling the prosecution's case with the poise of a seasoned attorney, the air inside the Los Angeles County Courthouse grew dense, charged with an energy that made it hard to breathe. The gallery was packed, every seat occupied by spectators who whispered among themselves, drawn in by the unexpected shift in the courtroom. They had come expecting a routine hearing, a swift conviction. But now they were witnessing something else entirely. At the defendant's table stood Jalen Dawson, a young man who seemed almost swallowed by the massive piece of furniture in front of him. He kept his hands tucked into his pockets, his chin raised, not in defiance, but in quiet confidence. He was not afraid. The charges against him were severe: grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Heavy accusations for an 18-year-old. But as Judge Grayson studied him from the bench, his gaze sharp behind thin-rimmed glasses, it became clear. This trial wasn't just about the law. It was about perception, about power. Grayson leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping idly against the polished wood, his expression laced with something between amusement and condescension. "So, you think you're some kind of legal expert?" he mused, voice dry, laced with subtle mockery. "This isn't a debate club, kid." Laughter rippled through the courtroom, low chuckles from the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. They all saw it as a joke. Jalen did not. He didn't blink, didn't smile. He had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one, no. He had never imagined he would stand here as the accused. But the courtroom? He knew it like the back of his hand. While other kids memorized basketball stats, Jalen studied legal precedents. While his friends spent hours gaming, he played out mock trials in his mind, arguing cases with himself, refining his reasoning, sharpening his knowledge. His mother, Denise Dawson, had spent over 2 decades working as a paralegal. Jalen had grown up listening to her stories, the quiet corruption that seeped into the system, the prosecutors who cut corners, the judges who played favorites, the defense attorneys who barely put up a fight. He had absorbed everything. By the time he was 15, he could break down a trial with the precision of a law student. But none of that mattered to Grayson. To him, Jalen was just another troubled kid, another name in a file, another case to clear before lunch. The judge sighed, flipping open the case file with barely a glance. "Let's get this over with. I've got a golf game at 3. More laughter echoed through the room, but this time something shifted. Jalen's lips twitched into the faintest smirk, because Grayson had just made his first mistake, and no one in the courtroom had realized it yet. Mitchell Carrington, the prosecutor, rose from his seat with the unshakable confidence of a man who had already won. He smoothed down his immaculate suit, adjusted his perfectly knotted tie, and began speaking in the polished, rehearsed cadence of someone who had delivered the same speech 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the defendant, Jalen Dawson, was caught in possession of a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing mere hours before his arrest. Law enforcement pursued the suspect through downtown, where he allegedly attempted to evade capture before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence, Your Honor, speaks for itself." Carrington's voice was steady, certain. He had built his case on facts, on hard proof. But Jalen knew that facts could be twisted, and he was about to show them all just how easily the truth could unravel. The prosecutor's words landed like a hammer against stone. Heavy, deliberate, meant to leave cracks that could not be undone. The crowd in the gallery stirred, shifting in their seats, exchanging hushed whispers that rippled through the room like an undercurrent. On the surface, the case seemed damning. A stolen vehicle, a high-speed chase, a suspect fleeing from the police. The details painted a picture that was impossible to ignore, a narrative that seemed all too familiar. Judge Grayson peered over the rim of his glasses, his gaze flicking toward Jalen for the briefest moment before settling back on Carrington. "Go on," he said. The prosecutor moved with practiced ease, his polished shoes clicking rhythmically against the courtroom floor as he made his way toward the jury box. Every movement, every measured pause, was carefully designed to reinforce the inevitability of his argument. "The defense may attempt to spin this," Carrington said, his voice smooth with just the right amount of controlled skepticism. "They may try to convince you that this is all, well, one big misunderstanding, that Mr. Dawson is merely an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He stopped, turning sharply toward Jalen, his eyes locking onto the young man for the first time since the proceedings began. "But let's be honest," he continued, his voice dropping just enough to pull the room in closer. "What kind of victim runs from the police?" The air in the courtroom thickened. The unspoken weight of his words pressed down on the spectators, filling the spaces between their silent judgments. Judge Grayson leaned forward, resting his chin against his hand, his expression unreadable. Jalen didn't move. He didn't flinch. His eyes remained steady, watching, absorbing. Carrington continued, flipping through a stack of neatly arranged documents, his confidence unwavering. "Your Honor," he said, holding up a page for effect, "I have here the sworn testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, the responding officer who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before he attempted to flee. The vehicle was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book." Judge Grayson exhaled sharply through his nose, nodding, his fingers tapping against the polished wood of his desk. "Sounds pretty straightforward to me," he murmured, and to most people in the room, it did. The story had been laid out in clean, indisputable lines. A stolen car, a pursuit, an arrest, a case that practically argued itself. But Jalen had spent too many years studying the way trials unfolded, the way narratives were shaped and evidence presented. He had seen how easily the cracks in a case could be overlooked when no one bothered to look for them. So he said nothing. Not yet. Instead, he waited. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly against the bench, his voice carrying over the murmurs that had begun to stir again. "All right," he said. "Let's hear the defense's response." He turned toward the defense table, his gaze settling on Jalen's assigned attorney, a public defender named Lisa Thornton, who had barely spoken since the trial had begun. She rose from her seat hesitantly, shifting from foot to foot, her hands tightening around the edges of the table. "Your Honor, my client—" Jalen reached out, placing a steady hand on her arm. A silent request. A quiet decision. She hesitated, searching his face for a moment, then nodded before slowly sinking back into her chair. And for the first time since the trial had begun, Jalen Dawson spoke. "I'll be representing myself, Your Honor." A hush fell over the room. For the first time, true silence settled across the courtroom. Not the kind born from boredom or routine, but the kind that came when something entirely unexpected shifted the foundation beneath it. Judge Grayson stared at him, and for the first time his amusement was clear. "You'll what?" Jalen's voice remained even, unwavering. "I'll be defending myself." The ripple of murmurs returned, growing louder, spreading through the crowd like wildfire. The bailiff's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Carrington's smirk faltered just for a fraction of a second before he let out a short, dry laugh. "This," he muttered, shaking his head, "should be interesting." But no one was laughing when Jalen took his first step forward, because in that moment, the atmosphere in the courtroom changed. The weight of it all settled over him. The stares, the expectations, the assumptions. He adjusted his stance, grounding himself, but his hands remained tucked in his pockets. He let the silence stretch just a little longer, long enough to make them uncomfortable. Then, at last, he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, measured, deliberate. "Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Carrington raised an eyebrow, his arms crossing over his chest. "Go ahead." And just like that, the first crack in the case appeared. Jalen stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate, his eyes locked onto Carrington. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before my arrest, that's correct?" Carrington exhaled sharply, his patience already thinning. That's right. And that testimony, Jalen continued, his voice steady, is written in his official report? Carrington let out a short, dismissive breath. Of course it is. Jalen nodded, then turned his gaze toward Judge Grayson. Your Honor, I move to have that testimony dismissed as evidence. Grayson's eyes narrowed slightly, his curiosity piqued. On what grounds? For the first time, Jalen pulled his hands from his pockets, his fingers flexing slightly before he gestured toward the prosecution's table. Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car, Jalen stated, his voice unwavering. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began. A flicker of confusion crossed Carrington's face. What are you talking about? Jalen took another step forward, his presence growing. Your Honor, if the court permits, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he saw me driving, then his location history should confirm that. He let the words hang in the air before delivering the final blow. But I have a feeling it won't. The murmurs in the gallery swelled, a rising tide of doubt. Judge Grayson frowned, his gaze shifting toward Carrington. The prosecutor cleared his throat, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. That report was filed by a sworn officer of the law, Your Honor, he said, his voice edged with irritation. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional? Jalen shrugged, casual, unbothered. If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS records will prove it. But if he wasn't, his voice trailed off, the implication sharp enough to cut through the room. Grayson studied him for a long moment before shifting his attention to the prosecution. Counselor, he said, does the state have any issue with verifying these logs? Carrington hesitated. The pause was brief, just a breath, but it was enough. The jury noticed, the spectators noticed, and most importantly, Judge Grayson noticed. Jalen inhaled deeply, controlled, steady. He had spent years watching prosecutors work, analyzing how they twisted facts, how they maneuvered through the system, bending it in their favor. And if there was one thing he had learned, one thing he knew beyond a shadow of a doubt, it was this. If Carrington truly believed in his case, he wouldn't be stalling. Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. Counselor? Carrington finally shook his head. No objections, Your Honor. But the damage was already done. Something had shifted. The laughter was gone. The quiet in the courtroom was no longer laced with amusement. It was thick with tension, with the weight of something unraveling. Carrington adjusted his tie, shuffling the papers in front of him, his confidence no longer as polished, his control beginning to slip. Your Honor, he pressed on, his voice a fraction tighter than before. While we wait for those records, one fact remains undeniable. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen nodded, his expression unreadable. That's true. He took another step forward, his voice calm, measured. But let's talk about that for a second. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow, giving him the floor. Jalen turned to the jury, his eyes moving from one face to the next, letting each of them feel the weight of his gaze. The prosecution wants you to believe that because my fingerprints were in that car, it means I stole it. That's the story they're telling. He let the statement settle, let them absorb it. Then, with the ease of someone who had rehearsed this moment in his head 1,000 times, he continued. But let's think about this logically. His tone remained steady, controlled, pulling them in. Say you walk into a department store, you see a jacket you like, you try it on, put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up. Then you take it off, put it back on the rack, and leave. His voice softened just slightly, making them lean in. A few hours later, someone else walks into that same store and steals that jacket. Jalen paused, letting the image form in their minds. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors glanced at each other. Somewhere in the gallery, someone muttered something under their breath. And just like that, doubt had entered the room. Jalen didn't give them a moment to breathe. The car at the center of this case had been parked outside for hours before the alleged theft even took place. I was with 3 of my friends inside that store. And yes, when we walked past that car, I couldn't help myself. I leaned against it. I even opened the door, but it was already unlocked. I didn't think much of it at the time. I didn't take the car. I didn't drive it. I didn't take a single thing from inside. It was just a fleeting moment of curiosity, a dumb mistake. He let the silence linger for a moment, letting that sink in. Then, with a voice as sharp as a scalpel, one that sliced through the quiet room, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Carrington shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, flipping through his notes in a desperate search for something, anything, to regain control of the situation. But Jalen wasn't done. He didn't wait. "And while we're at it," he continued, his voice steady but laced with conviction, "let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was conducted." Turning to Grayson, he addressed him directly. "Your Honor, was the forensic expert who handled the analysis of the prints in this case subpoenaed to testify?" Grayson blinked, caught off guard. His eyes darted over to Carrington, who hesitated, then muttered, "No." Jalen's lips tightened into a firm line. "So, let me make sure I understand this," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "The state is trying to use forensic evidence to convict me, but they didn't think it was important to bring in the actual expert who processed that evidence? No chance for me to cross-examine, to ask about the chain of custody, or to challenge the accuracy of the analysis?" Carrington's jaw clenched in frustration. Jalen nodded once, the point landing. "Interesting," he murmured, his tone chilling. Judge Grayson let out a heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose as if the weight of it all was suddenly sinking in. It was the look of a man realizing that this case was far from the easy win he'd imagined it would be. But Jalen wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. He stepped forward slowly, every movement deliberate, his voice firm, yet calm. "Your Honor," he said, "I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson frowned, clearly puzzled. "The owner?" Jalen nodded with a quiet certainty. "Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi, provided a statement to the police. However, for some reason, that statement was never submitted in the prosecution's filings. And I think I know why." He turned to Carrington, his eyes locking onto him with an intensity that sent a ripple through the room. "Do you remember what Mr. Whitaker told officers the night his car was reported stolen?" Carrington's jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin line. He knew exactly what was coming next. Jalen didn't give him the chance to respond. Instead, he reached into his file, pulling out a printed transcript, and began to read aloud. "I left my car running. When I rushed into the gas station, I had no idea that, while I was inside, some kid must have jumped into the car and taken off. But here's the thing. The guy you arrested? He wasn't the one. The kid I saw? He was white." A collective gasp spread through the courtroom, rippling like a wave through the air. Jalen held up the paper in his hand, his voice steady but full of conviction. "This," he said, "is from the original police report. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned." He turned back to Judge Grayson, his gaze unflinching. "The arresting officer admitted this in his testimony, yet the prosecution chose to ignore it. And now they want this jury to believe that I, someone who doesn't even fit the description of the actual thief, am guilty beyond a reasonable doubt." Carrington stepped forward, his words scrambling to hold on to any sense of control. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle." But Jalen didn't budge. He shook his head, his voice cutting through the air like a knife. "No," he said, calm but forceful. "I wasn't caught in possession of anything." The words didn't rise in volume, but they sliced through the tension in the room with precision. "I was arrested blocks away from where the car was abandoned. I was walking home with my friends after we'd stopped to grab some snacks." His eyes locked on Carrington's. "I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anyone. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions." Judge Grayson let out a long, slow breath, rubbing his temple in frustration. The case was falling apart, unraveling right before everyone's eyes, and everyone knew it. Jalen turned back to face the jury. His voice grew heavier, more pointed. The real suspect got away that night. The officers found a black kid in the area and decided that was close enough. That's what this case is really about. Silence. Judge Grayson cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses as he tried to regain some semblance of order. "Does the prosecution have anything further?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with finality. Carrington's face was flushed, his jaw tight. "No, Your Honor," he said, his words flat, defeated. Judge Grayson exhaled sharply, glancing at Jalen for a long moment before his eyes moved to the jury. Finally, he leaned forward, his voice steady as he spoke the words that would echo in everyone's mind. "Case dismissed." A beat of stunned silence followed. Then the chaos erupted. Half the courtroom exploded in disbelief, others in quiet relief. The gallery stirred, the reporters furiously scribbling in their notebooks, capturing the moment for everyone outside the room. Jalen didn't move right away. He let the moment linger, allowing the gravity of what had just happened to settle into the air, to sink in for everyone who'd witnessed it. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel tightly, watched Jalen with an unreadable expression. There was something different in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Recognition, perhaps. Maybe even a flicker of regret. Jalen met his gaze for a moment before he turned to leave, but just as he reached the door, the judge's voice called out once more, "Mr. Dawson." Jalen stopped but didn't turn around. He stood there waiting. Grayson hesitated, his voice quieter now, more personal. "You should consider law school," he said, almost as if he wasn't entirely sure of the words himself. Jalen smirked, a quiet confidence in his expression. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside, the air was thick with voices, reporters crowding the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing like wildfire, microphones thrust toward him like weapons. "Jalen, did you know the judge was going to dismiss the case? What's next for you? How does it feel to outsmart a prosecutor with so much experience?" Jalen ignored the flood of questions, pulling his hoodie up over his head. He wasn't interested in the attention or the spectacle. This wasn't about proving how clever he was. It was about something far bigger than that. His mother, Denise, was standing at the bottom of the courthouse steps. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment she just stared at him, the silence stretching between them. Finally, she shook her head, letting out a heavy breath. "Boy, you scared me half to death," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jalen chuckled, rubbing the back of his head, the weight of the moment still sinking in. "Had to take a risk, Ma," he said softly. She looked at him for a moment longer, then pulled him into a tight embrace. "You always were the stubborn one," she murmured, holding him close. The cameras kept flashing, but Jalen barely noticed them now, the noise and the lights fading into the background. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched, his posture different from before. The arrogance that had once been in his expression was gone. It had shifted into something quieter, something closer to reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything special. To him, it was just another routine day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now, standing there watching Jalen, he knew he'd remember this one, because Jalen had done something that most people couldn't. He had made the system take a hard look at itself, and for once, it blinked first. There was a lesson to be learned here. How many other cases had gone down this path? How many lives had been impacted not because of solid evidence, but because of bias, shortcuts, and a system that cared more about closing cases than uncovering the truth? Jalen had the knowledge, the strength, and the determination to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about Jalen or one case. It was about all of them. And Jalen knew what he had to do next. This courtroom wouldn't be the last one he stepped into. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He would be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be standing alone. If this story made you think, just for a moment, then share it. The justice system is built on laws, yes, but it's run by people, and people can change. But only if we demand it. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter. Let's keep the conversation going. Because the next time this happens, it might not be Jalen. It might be someone you know,